And finally, and most importantly, I'd like to introduce our speaker today. Her name is Linda Bassett, and she writes a weekly food column called Kitchen Call, which appears in the North Shore Sunday and the Merrimack River Current. And she teaches American regional cooking at North Shore Community College and has published articles in the Radcliffe Culinary Times, in the Journal of the Culinary Historians of Boston. And she's from Marblehead, by the way. And she also is a contributor to the upcoming Oxford University Press Encyclopedia of American Food and Drink, which is a great honor to be asked to contribute to. So again, remember our book signing afterwards, and for now, please help me welcome Linda Bassett. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I hope you can hear me. For anybody who hasn't had a taste of frittata, there's a huge one over there. Get a taste. I'm a cook by trade, so I'm more accustomed to seeing people eating when they're sitting down in front of me. So it makes me more comfortable. So I'm glad everybody who brought their lunch. That's great, too. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you all for being here. Let me start in the beginning of how this book came about, and then go on to Food of the North Shore, which I'm supposed to be talking about. Everybody who writes a cookbook seems to have an influence that came from somewhere. Mine started early in a family where cooking is a competitive sport. It's actually a contact sport in my family. Everybody cooks, and the influence was from Italian immigrant grandparents who ran a food-centered home, and that's where it all began. Right to this generation, where actually I have a brother in the restaurant business. He sells steak. He competes very highly with my other brother, who's a vegetarian. So you can imagine the discussions around the family tables. I also live on the North Shore, and it's really interesting, the two things that I do. I write for a newspaper called the North Shore Sunday, and I teach at a college called North Shore Community College. So it makes sense that finally the cookbook that came from me is called, or has North Shore somewhere in its title. Actually, it says North of Boston. We had to get Boston in there. But I do spend my time writing about cooks and about the neighborhoods on the North Shore, and I have spent a lot of years talking to cooks over the North Shore, all over the North Shore, and investigating their kitchens and what they cook and what they do. And over the years, I've found that food is history. There have been other influences. Actually, the speaker that you had here last week was one of the influences, Barbara Haber. And some of the people in my book, of course, were the influences. But food is kind of, until recently, was the missing piece in history. It links history with our daily lives, and people don't realize it. Most of food is vastly undocumented, or until recently has been vastly undocumented. You can find it documented in places like something that we probably don't want to think about, but it's very much in our mind now, warfare. Lists and lists of logistics of what was needed to go into battle, from ancient Rome to the Civil War to World War II rations to MREs. And that's where we find it, but so much of home cooking, everyday food is widely undocumented, and that's the food that we use on a daily basis, or that we celebrate with. We celebrate a birth or a holiday. Food is even present at a funeral. Go to the movies, there's food. Go to a ball game. Take a look at what's happening at Fenway Park now, and how much food is available. It's not just hot dogs anymore. Go to the mall, and there's always a center for food at a mall now. Go on a cruise, and you eat 6-8 meals a day. So there's food everywhere, and it's just such an integral part of our lives. But it's at home that the food becomes part of our daily history. And that's the food that was largely undocumented. And because so, it's become more linked with folklore and legend than real history. Let me tell you a story that I found right in my own town. And you've probably heard of this fella recently. His name is Joe Brown. And he was a soldier in the Revolutionary War. However, he was controversial in his time, and he's still controversial to this day. And you probably may recall back in the fall, there was a huge brouhaha over a piece of art that depicted Joe Brown that was put on the front of the high school, and many people found offensive. And so it was taken down. But that's not what links him to food. Joe was controversial in his day. Why? Not because he was descended from freed slaves, not because he was a Revolutionary War hero who actually opened a tavern. Well, that's probably why. Because he opened a tavern in the house that he bought, and he lived on a hill that became the bad part of town. It's where the sailors hung out. It's where the fishermen hung out. And actually, they were having a really good time. So it was controversial to the ministers of the day, and he was, because drinking went on in his house, and dancing, he loved to play the fiddle. And that's what made him controversial. However, in the daytime, his house was a bakery. His wife, Lucretia, made wedding cakes. But more importantly, and what's come down through history, is the cookies she made that Joe took and brought down to the dock, which was down the hill from their house, and sold. Next door to their house was a big pond, and frogs lived in the pond. So the cookies became known for Joe and for the frogs, and they're called Joe Froggers. They're the typical molasses cookies that you find all over the place, but they got Joe's name because the sailors would buy them on the dock, and they would take them to sea with them, and they lasted a long time. Now, these cookies are still sold in Marblehead. In fact, at certain times you can walk through the town and see signs out in front of stores that say Joe Froggers are here. And people rush into the stores and buy Joe Froggers, and off they go with their nice little molasses cookies. The thing is that nobody knows what Joe Froggers looked like because the recipe wasn't written down till about 100 years ago. And these were made back right after the American Revolution. So, the legend goes that they were big and round and flat like the lily pads on the pond, or were they little and fat like the frogs that sat on the lily pads? No one knows because no one ever wrote it down. Nobody ever wrote down a recipe till 100 years ago. Now, the recipes are all the same, and the recipe is in the book. They're all the same, but you just don't know which way you should make the cookies. So he became legendary in that way. Joe, again, still, wherever you find a story about this fella, nobody really knows a whole lot about him. So you might find him depicted as a very intelligent businessman, or you may find him depicted as the town drunk. Again, you really need to write these things down. So why wasn't home cooking written down? Well, there are a few reasons. One was because people didn't think it was important, anything that went on every day in your house. People just didn't think that was important. More importantly, the second reason is that cooks were usually illiterate. Now, I'm not saying this in a disrespectful manner, but usually the cook in the house was the woman. Little girls were sent to school for only a short amount of time, if they were sent at all. And their education was mostly conducted at their mother's and grandmother's knee. So they learned in the home. They learned the home arts. They learned to cook. They learned to sew. They learned to keep a house. They didn't learn to read and write. They did have a prolific amount of recipes. So how did they remember them? One of the ways they remembered them was poetry, believe it or not. I'm sure they remembered them by rote because they made them so many times. But every so often you find a poem. And I have one from way back in the book. Someone was intelligent enough to print in the Saturday Evening Post back in 1751. I'll read it to you, and then you'll figure out kind of what it was. I won't read you the whole thing, but this is a recipe in poetry. First lay some onions to keep the pork from burning, because now it'll tell you what it is. In chowder there can be no turning. Then lay some pork in slices thin, thus in chowder you must begin. Now lay some fish out crosswise, then season well with pepper, salt, and spice, parsley, sweet marjoram, savory, and thyme, then biscuit next, which must be soaked some time. So there you have the recipe for chowder. You notice that there is no milk in that chowder from 1751, and I'm sure that lots of people said that poem over and over again so that they could remember the recipe for chowder. So how do you find these recipes, and how do you dig up what people cooked? Well, the first thing I did was turn to old diaries. And again, I'm on the North Shore, and I was looking on the North Shore for old diaries. And one I found was written in the late 18th century by a wife of a butcher in Newburyport. Her name was Sarah Emery. And she wrote quite prolifically, but not just about cooking. You had to kind of pull the cooking out of there. One of the things she wrote about back in the late 18th century was biscuit pudding. It was a favorite of Newburyport's seafaring men. Now, what was biscuit pudding made with? Well, most likely it was made with pilot crackers or pilot bread, because this was made at John Pearson's commercial bakery up in Newburyport. That was built in 1794. The crackers were an evolution of ship's biscuits, which was kind of a hardtack, like a brick made out of flour that they took on ships and they put into chowder. They made all kinds of other things with it, I'm sure, and one of the things must have been this pudding. The interesting thing about this bakery, John Pearson's bakery, is over the centuries it eventually became Nabisco. So you're familiar with it, even though you think you're not. Another diary that I looked back at, and another published diary, is one by a woman named Lucy Larcom. Now, Lucy Larcom is known for this diary because it's about the mills in Lowell. But if you go way back, it tells about her girlhood in Beverly. In the mid-19th century, she wrote about her life in Beverly. And one of the interesting things, and I haven't found it anywhere else, maybe other historians have, is that she claimed that baked beans came from Beverly. The beans that we call Boston baked beans. I noticed down in the gift shop there are little bean pots that say Boston baked beans on it. Well, in a book that Lucy wrote called New England Girlhood, it was written in 1890, she wrote this, that towns were once given nicknames. Ours was called Beantown, she wrote, because it adhered to the Puritanic custom of baking beans on Saturday. I'm sure that everybody baked their beans on Saturday, but maybe Beverly did call Beantown. A little further on in history, actually maybe 20 years ago, a fellow named Robert Cahill wrote that the brown and white earthenware bean pots were produced at Lawrence Pottery in Beverly, and that's probably where that came from. He claimed that Beverly veterans brought a gift to every Union soldier, a famous Beverly bean pot. When they asked where they had obtained the lovely bean pots, the answer was Boston. And so it stuck that Boston was. Now, again, this is researched many, many years later, and probably a lot of it is hearsay, a lot of it is legend and folklore. Again, that's why it's so important to write these things down. when they do happen. One more diary that I looked at, and this was a book written by Edward Murphy, who was born about the time Lucy Larcom had written her book. Edward Murphy lived in Salem, and he wrote, again, about baked beans. This is a great thing to write about. Evidently it was, well, because it was Saturday night's meal. But one of the things he wrote was about getting baked beans. You think the pizza delivery is a recent phenomenon. Well, not according to Edward Murphy, who wrote about this in the 1920s. Just around sunset on Saturday night, Mr. Morgan and his horse, Minnie, would woe to a stop at each steady customer's gate. There in the box on his stood 3 big-bellied earthen pots. I'd lick my chops holding out Mom's yellow mixing bowl to receive as much as 2 thin dimes could ladle up for our evening meal. So he goes on to describe these wonderful baked beans and the aroma coming from this cart that Minnie is bringing. The interesting thing is that if he'd never written this down, we wouldn't know about this. We wouldn't have the memory. We have a very vivid picture here of the horse pulling up to the houses with the baked beans and the kids running out with the bowls. We wouldn't know about Mr. Morgan. We wouldn't know that his horse was named Minnie. And the custom may have been forgotten because people think it's thought at the time it was too mundane. Today we don't think so. Today we think it's pretty exciting to learn this. So once I had these people down, I thought, well, I think I need to tell this story with people because people are the history. And lo and behold, into my classroom walks Laura Lee Cooney, a retired woman who decided that she was going to go back to college and get a degree in culinary arts. And one day, Laura Lee came into class with a 1922 Fannie Farmer textbook or recipe book that many of us have in our homes now, our mothers had in their homes. Along came Laura Lee with this book. The book was battered, broken, the spine was broken, there were food splatters on every page, and it was held together with an old garter. Between the pages and in the margin were a wealth of information. She explained to me that this was her grandmother's book, Johanna Teresa Cotter Sanderson, better known as Annie. Annie had been a cook on Eastern Point, up on the North Shore, a wonderful vacation area with big old homes. She worked in the summer cottages. She worked at Myopia Hunt Club, and finally she ended up in the turret of the Hammond Castle, where she was the cook. She had notes tucked in between the pages. They were orders for what dinner would be that night. Many of them were signed by the people she worked for. It was just a wealth of information. It was really interesting, and I realized that there was so much more, that there were so many people with so much information all over the North Shore. So I started digging, and that's how I came out with all of the profiles and the people in this book that tell the story of food on the North Shore. So now I can tell you about some of the people in the book and how I found out about the wonderful things there. Let me tell you about Lily Jones. Lily Jones is the soul food queen of the North Shore. I met her when someone told me I needed to volunteer to cook at this Martin Luther King dinner, where Lily was presiding over the kitchen. Lily's picture's on the cover of the book. She's an incredible woman. Well, the menu had things like fried chicken, collards, potato salad, sweet potato pie, all these wonderful things on the menu. And I thought this was a great opportunity. I could go in and learn how to make some of these things. So I walked into her kitchen with great recommendations and this incredible introduction about how I was a professional cook and I really should meet Lily, and Lily should really meet me and all of this. And Lily looked at me and she said, okay, go make the salads. That's what I did the first Martin Luther King dinner with her. I worked many more Martin Luther King dinners with her and finally learned how to make some other things after I had proven myself that I could make the salads. Another person in the book, while we're talking about African American food, was a civil rights leader who I'd known all my life, but never thought about him in connection with food. He had stories that were incredible. He had left Texas one step ahead of the lynch mob, and I guess there's still a tree there waiting for him. I was told that by other people, not by him. But I approached him for barbecue. I wanted a barbecue recipe. There are no barbecue recipes in this book, but I met the best people finding out that I wasn't going to get a barbecue recipe. Barbecue is a man thing. It's a guy thing. And they just don't give out their recipes. And let me tell you why. I need to quote from Abner Darby. He said to me, and there are two things inherent in barbecue. First of all, you must brag. You must brag about the best barbecue. You have the best barbecue in the world. And secondly, it has a future. This is what Abner said to me. Everyone loves my barbecue. Closest I ever tasted to mine was Kansas City. I worked in a place there for a short time. The owner chased me all over to see how I did it, but I never let on. He claimed that he had told his grandmother he would never give the recipe to anybody outside the family, and that he just would not part with it. But the future was that someday he intended to market his barbecue sauce, and his cousin was already doing it, and he was thinking along those lines himself. So I wasn't going to get anything out of Abner, so the next person I approached was George Boomer Scott. Now, you probably remember him because he played for the Red Sox back when they were in the World Series quite a while ago. At one point, he was the coach of a team called the Massachusetts Mad Dogs, which played in Lynn. That was their home field. And I was lucky enough to go over and interview him. Well, I spent a wonderful week with George, but I never, ever got a barbecue recipe. I watched him sign pictures. I watched batting practice. I got to watch barbecue made, but I never knew what was in it. And he told me kind of the same thing. I never tasted any sauce like mine. I'm one of the best in the world. And the future was, someday I'm going to open a place near Fenway. And so I'm waiting because it was great barbecue. There is a character up on the North Shore now. His name is Smokin' Joe. He goes from one parking lot to another in Gloucester with his smoker, and he supposedly makes the best barbecue on the North Shore. If you're lucky, you can catch him up there somewhere. But you really do have to chase him. You have to look around for him. You have to ask people in town which parking lot he's in, and you might find him on a hot summer day and get some barbecue. But you won't get a recipe here. And he won't give you the recipe either. So I needed to look some other places for some other kinds of ethnic foods and foods of the immigrants who settled the North Shore. I found food everywhere. I found food under the sacred cod at the State House, where I spoke with, and again, another person I could have spent days and days speaking with, Representative Tony Verga, whose family immigrated from Italy. He spoke in very evocative terms about his father, about his grandparents, about people who cooked in his family. But he was also a cook. He was a fisherman. And he eventually owned his own place where he cooked wonderful, wonderful sauce and told me stories about putting tuna in the sauce and people coming in for it. But let me just quote a little bit about him, of what he told me. He told me, I grew up with good food. Everybody told me this in this book. that they grew up with good food. My dad was a cook on a fishing boat. Summers in high school, I went out with him. He cooked pasta every night, sometimes with greens, sometimes mackerel, sometimes shrimp. Always different, always good. It was hard work. There was a coal stove on that boat. My father could do anything on that thing. In the morning, he soft-boiled eggs. To this day, I like 2 soft-boiled eggs for breakfast. The first one, I knock off the top, dip in the toast. I drink the second. A lot of Italians drink their eggs. It was an education to talk with him, and I had come from an Italian family. But I realized the more people that I talked with up in Gloucester of Sicilian heritage, the more people could sit and talk for hours about food. In that chapter, there's also another interesting man I found. He's an undertaker who grows fig trees. That was his way of keeping his Italian heritage alive. I spoke with people who had Jewish backgrounds, and I got recipes everywhere. One of the most interesting places I found a recipe was on the baseball field. So much of this book harks back to baseball. But the center fielder's grandmother on my son's team had probably the definitive recipe for chopped liver, and she had this great little addition that she put in the chopped liver, and it was a little bit of peanut butter. This is one of the things that I found wrapped into every single group, is that when people immigrated, they couldn't always get the products that they used in other countries. And so they started to substitute. And they would take something that was close, something they could substitute, and put it into the dishes and approximate the flavor or come close to the flavor. Turning back to my students, to my classroom, one of my recent graduates who works in an Italian restaurant and cooks wonderful Italian food was born in Cambodia. So I talked to her for a long time about her life and about where she had come from and about her food. She was more interested in the Italian food that she was cooking, and she was more interested in the fact that she and her family had recently pooled all their money and bought a house and had their first real 4th of July. Let me tell you a little bit about her. She was born in a refugee camp. Her parents had escaped the killing fields. She told me that her parents had been introduced in the refugee camp, and she was born there. And then her brother was born when they got here. They both started culinary school. Her brother found he was more interested in other things and went elsewhere. But she was just learning. After having gone to culinary school and learned all the things she wanted, then she was digging into her heritage. And then she was finding things. And she found things like ketchup was used in some places in place of fish sauces or things that they couldn't find at the grocery store. So it was a really interesting thing that little piece was in there. The substitution. There were substitutions all over the place. Some of the substitutions changed recipes a lot, and some of them are still kind of up in the air as to whether they're a new recipe or an old recipe. I found a lot of similarities as I went through things. As I found fried dough at the Topsfield Fair. Everybody knows you go to a fair, you find fried dough. The Italian immigrants brought fried dough over with them, and they stuffed it with anchovies for Christmas Eve. The Greek immigrants do fried dough as well. They drizzle it with honey and serve it in paper cones. Back again to Father Murphy, who we talked about earlier, he also describes a fried dough that people ate for breakfast back in Salem when they had nothing else in the house. They mixed up a little flour and some water, and they fried it in the big black spider, and they called it turns. So just about every culture you can find a little bit of that. The shipboard stews, the chowder that we talked about in the beginning there, just about every culture had a chowder that was made on a ship if they had a seafaring background. The Portuguese who came to the North Shore in search of cod because they were seafaring men and were great on the ocean, had their own version of chowder called a caldeira. They put tomatoes in it. It was nothing like the chowder that was already here. The Italian fishermen also had a chowder. They never called it a chowder. They always called it a cioppino. There's a great deal of exchange between the Italian fishermen in Gloucester and the Italian fishermen in San Francisco. I found that many of the Sicilian fishermen I talked to in Gloucester either had relatives in San Francisco or had gone to San Francisco and fished there for a while. I guess it made them better fishermen. So the cioppino ended up back on the North Shore. Back in the 1930s, a chef named Louis de Goy wrote a cookbook in which he said that the chowder that we call Manhattan clam chowder was served all over the North Shore, in Nahant and Gloucester and Swampscott. I thought that one out, and I think that probably he must have run into fishermen's families who were serving the caldeiras and the cioppinos and maybe thought it was. Again, we're not really sure. We found a lot of other similarities. People like to wrap leaves around things. So in one culture, the Polish culture, you found that they wrapped cabbage leaves around rice. They substituted something there. They put tomato soup. Good old Campbell's tomato soup goes into that. That's a substitute in this country. Grape leaves are wrapped around rice by the Greeks. That's what happens when food goes from its natural place on the planet to a new place. If people can't get things, they adapt things, they substitute, they import things. In the olden days, they couldn't import, so that's why they adapted and they substituted. And that's how dishes came out the way they are. The one more place I explored, I tried to keep away from restaurants, but home cooking does go outside the home, and it did go outside the home in two kind of traditional places. And the two places were private clubs on one end and diners on the other end. But if you looked at the menus of both of those places, you found the same thing on their menus. Grandma's pot roast is on the menu of both private clubs and diners. So is roast beef. So is rice pudding. So is potatoes O'Brien. Very interesting that the whole gamut. Why? Because people like to go out somewhere that isn't their home, and they want all the comforts of home. And what they want is what grandma cooks or what mother cooks. Food is comfort on a cold night. Food is history. Ultimately, food means home, family, being cared for. Immigrant food means that somebody cared enough for a future generation to risk the hardships and the loneliness of a new country. I just want to end with one thing. There is one restaurant on the North Shore that was considered probably the most cutting-edge restaurant. The most popular dessert on their menu was not one of the cutting-edge things. It was Nana's chocolate cake. It was the owner's grandmother's chocolate cake, and she would make it a couple of times a month, and he'd bring it to work and put it on the menu, and it was gone really quickly. It was probably the most popular dessert because, in the end, that's what food means, home and family. Thank you. Are we all set? If there are questions, I guess we have time. Yes, sir.
I was wondering if you know anything about the origin of the word cooking. The British don't use it.
No, they use biscuit.
What?
They use biscuit. Biscuit. It's an American word, or at least the first time it was used was in print. Amelia Simmons used it in her book in 1796. But I think it was very much an American word. There are some people that say it evolved from a German word as well. I'm not sure, but I know in this country, the first time it was seen in print was in that book.
And, I mean, is there any explanation
why she used the word cookie? You know what? I know that Joe Carlin's in the audience today, and he could probably give you a whole better answer on that because he's a real expert on Amelia Simmons. So I'll introduce you at the end. He's two rows behind you.
I know a lot of church groups put out cookbooks or collections of recipes. I wonder if those were useful to you and how far back you would find those.
Yes, I did kind of rely on some old books. I got some interesting things out of them. For instance, and there are some church groups that are absolutely wonderful, still keep publishing these things. But I got things like tomato soup cake from the Depression. Evidently, that was a huge thing in the Depression, and it came from visiting one of these groups that had put together a book, and they were all talking about what they called depression cake. And I asked, what is that? And they said, well, here it is in this book that we have, tomato soup cake. You use tomato soup, and it's a spice cake. It doesn't taste like tomatoes at all. It's really delicious. Yes, sir.
You talked about baked beans being a Saturday night thing, and I thought the
Right.
tradition was that baked beans were a Sunday thing because you could put it on the oven Saturday night and then go off to church, which would typically be from early in the morning until 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
Right. They were, well, I was talking about the 1920s, but I know that they were typical breakfast before that because they were put in overnight and they had them for Sunday morning breakfast. And there are still breakfasts that serve baked beans as a tradition. I could probably name you a whole list of political breakfasts I've been to where they've kept that tradition. Is there another question? Barbara? Well, that's true. Usually my students come in to learn, the old stuff that's not homogenized, cooking from scratch. Home cooking tends to be. People, I think it's a whole, from the 1950s on, we thought things were wonderful if they were made more convenient for us, and if they were made by scientists, they must be really good. And so we started, getting all of these I have to tell you that Barbara who just asked this question, is one of the profiles in the book, and she gave me this really interesting convenience recipe where she did a kugel where she, instead of opening the second can of pineapple, she just bought pineapple that was already in the cottage cheese, and it's absolutely spectacular. But yeah, that's the future. The future of cooking, I think, is very much evolving into a hobby. People cook on the weekends and they eat convenience foods during the week, and it's a fun thing to do on the weekends. Hopefully, we go back to eating healthier foods and not so much packaged and convenience foods, unless we're having your kugel with the pineapple. Yes?
I have a few recipes of my great-grandmothers that are just lists of ingredients, basically. Was it assumed that everyone knew how to do things? And when did they start
Absolutely.
writing down complete directions?
Absolutely, it was assumed that she knew how to cook because her mother or grandmother probably taught her how to cook. So she just wrote the ingredients down and she knew what she was supposed to do with them. If you look at chef's recipes, if you've ever seen a chef's recipe, it's almost the same. It's a list of ingredients and there'll be a bunch of ingredients and underneath it'll say bake 350. And because everybody is educated in this certain way, they know what to do with them before they get to bake 350 and the amount of time. I don't know exactly when people started to I hate to say I don't know for an answer, but I don't. Fannie Farmer absolutely did in this country. Fannie Farmer gave us amounts, because before that people wrote down, the size of a walnut or, a glass. Well, how big was the glass? A cup, was it a teacup? Was it a mug? So she gave measurements, and she also gave directions. And she was probably the beginning of the more scientific way of writing down recipes. But before her, there were a lot of other American cooks, starting with Amelia Simmons, who wrote down ways of doing things. They gave you the procedure, but it wasn't as clear as Fanny Farmer's. Hers was probably the clearest up until that time. Do we have time? Oh yes, but she was before Fanny Farmer, and again, she did as well. She was one who gave directions. Is there time for one? I saw one more hand, but yes.
I wanted to ask, apart from the diaries and the church cookbooks, were there other primary materials that you used, and to get this history?
A lot of people's memories. A lot of this has been, I'm sure, written down in other books, but I have people's memories of their family and their family cooking in there, and they're recipes that probably normally would never be written down because people thought they were just too mundane, or they cooked them every day, or they didn't think their mother or grandmother was famous enough to have their recipe in a book. And wherever you go, you're going to find somebody or some recipe that you think this should be in a book. It's wonderful enough.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.